The train arrived at Camp Concordia, Kansas, on a bitterly cold afternoon in January 1944. Inside the freight cars, 200 German prisoners of war sat in tense silence, bracing for what would come next. They had been captured in North Africa, shipped across the Atlantic in the holds of transport vessels, processed through a facility in New York, and now transported to the center of America, to a place so flat and empty it seemed like the edge of the world. Most of them were young, in their early 20s, though a few were veterans of the French campaign of Poland, men who had been soldiers for 5 years. They had been taught from their earliest training what to expect as prisoners. The lectures had been specific, detailed, designed to prepare them psychologically. If captured by the Soviets, they could expect execution or slow death in labor camps. If captured by the British, they might survive, but conditions would be harsh, retaliation for the Blitz. And if captured by the Americans, the lectures had been more ambiguous, but still ominous. The Americans, they were told, were a soft people, corrupted by wealth and racial mixing, but they could be cruel in unpredictable ways, especially to prisoners. One sergeant, captured at Kasserine Pass, had told the others during the Atlantic crossing that American guards would likely separate them, use psychological pressure, try to break their solidarity. As the train doors opened and cold Kansas wind rushed in, they prepared themselves for the worst. What happened in the next 60 minutes would shatter every assumption they had carried across the ocean. The first shock was the barracks. They had expected something like the holding facilities in North Africa. Tents, mud, barbed wire, the bare minimum required by the Geneva Conventions. What they found were wooden buildings with real floors, real roofs and heating stoves that actually worked. Each man was assigned a bunk with a mattress, not straw on the ground, but an actual mattress. They were issued 2 blankets, new and clean. The latrines were indoors with running water. One private from Bavaria, a boy who had been drafted at 17 and had spent his entire military career expecting the worst, stood in the middle of the barracks and looked around with an expression that his bunkmate later described as complete bewilderment. "This is better than our barracks in France," he said quietly. And it was. German military barracks, especially late in the war, were Spartan at best. These American POW facilities, built quickly in the heartland to house thousands of prisoners, were better constructed and better maintained than the quarters many of these men had known as soldiers of the Reich. This was the first crack in the narrative they had been taught. But it was only the beginning. The second shock came at dinner. They lined up, as soldiers do, expecting the kind of rations they had become accustomed to. Thin soup, black bread, perhaps some ersatz coffee. What they received was a metal tray piled with food. Real meat, not the mystery substitutes they had eaten for years. Potatoes, cooked and seasoned. Bread made from white flour, soft and fresh. Vegetables and butter, actual butter. Something that had become a distant memory in wartime Germany. The portions were not minimal. They were generous. More food than most of them had seen on a plate since before the war. Some of them hesitated, unsure if this was some kind of test or trick. But the American guards, noticing their hesitation, gestured for them to sit and eat. There was no ceremony, no speeches, no propaganda lecture. Just food, and the unspoken message that they would be fed properly. One German officer, a captain who had fought in France and North Africa, sat at a table with his men and quietly calculated the caloric content of the meal. It exceeded, by his estimate, what German soldiers on active duty were receiving on the Eastern Front. He said nothing, but the implication hung heavy in the air. If this was how America treated its prisoners, what resources did they have? What kind of nation could afford to feed enemy captives better than Germany fed its own fighting men? The third shock, the one that would be remembered and recounted in letters and post-war interviews for decades, came that evening. An American guard, a corporal from Iowa, approached a group of German prisoners sitting outside their barracks despite the cold, smoking the cigarettes they had been issued. American cigarettes, not the harsh, sawdust-filled substitutes they had known in the Wehrmacht. The corporal was young, perhaps 22, with a face that still held a trace of boyish openness. He asked in broken German learned from a phrase book if he could sit with them. The Germans exchanged glances, uncertain. Was this an interrogation technique, a trap? But the corporal simply sat down, pulled out his own pack of cigarettes, and offered them around. Then he did something that none of them had expected. He asked them where they were from, not in an interrogator's voice, not with the cold efficiency of intelligence gathering, but with simple human curiosity. One of the Germans, a sergeant from Hamburg, answered cautiously. The corporal nodded and said his own grandparents had come from Germany, from somewhere near Munich, though he had never been there himself. The conversation continued haltingly, a mixture of broken German and broken English, filled with gestures and misunderstandings, but unmistakably genuine. The corporal showed them a photograph of his family, a farm in Iowa, his parents standing in front of a barn. The Germans, slowly, began to show photographs from their own wallets, pictures of families they hadn't seen in years. And for 20 minutes on a cold Kansas evening, the war receded. And they were just young men far from home, sharing the universal language of cigarettes and family photographs. This interaction was not unique. It was, in fact, standard across the American POW camp system, though not by official design. There was no regulation requiring guards to be friendly, no training manual teaching them to share cigarettes and stories. What happened instead was something more organic, more deeply rooted in American culture. The guards were not professional soldiers, not career military men. They were farmers, factory workers, shop clerks, men who had been drafted or volunteered and who saw guard duty as a job, not a calling. And crucially, many of them were German-American themselves. By 1940, German was the second most common language spoken in American homes. Millions of Americans had parents or grandparents who had immigrated from Germany. The cultural connection was still strong. So when these American guards encountered German prisoners, they didn't see inhuman enemies. They saw people who reminded them of their own relatives, who spoke the language they had heard at their grandmother's dinner table, who came from towns whose names they recognized from family stories. The psychological distance that military training tries to instill, the dehumanization that makes killing possible, simply failed to take root in these interactions. And so the guards did what came naturally to them. They were decent. They were curious. They shared what they had. They treated the prisoners the way they would want to be treated themselves. It was not official policy. It was simply American character expressing itself in the least likely setting imaginable. The German prisoners struggled to integrate this reality with what they had been taught. National Socialist ideology had been very specific about America. It was a mongrel nation, they had been told, weakened by racial mixing, corrupted by democracy and materialism, incapable of the discipline and unity that made Germany strong. The lectures had been clear. Americans were soft, spoiled by easy lives, unable to endure hardship or to fight effectively. They were a merchant people, interested only in money and comfort, lacking the spiritual strength that came from true ideology and racial purity. Every German soldier had absorbed this narrative to some degree. It was in their training manuals, their newspapers, their radio broadcasts, the speeches their officers gave before battle. And now, imprisoned in America, they were confronting evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught. The guards were not weak. They were confident, relaxed, secure in their position. The country was not poor. The abundance of food, the quality of the facilities, the casual waste of resources that would have been hoarded preciously in Germany, all spoke of wealth beyond anything they had imagined. And most disturbing of all, the Americans were not hateful. They held no special animosity toward their prisoners. They treated them with a kind of default decency that seemed to be built into their character, not imposed by regulations, but arising naturally from their values. For many German POWs, this cognitive dissonance triggered a profound internal crisis. If America was what they were seeing, then what they had been taught was a lie. And if that was a lie, what else had been lies? The questioning started small. Conversations in the barracks late at night when the guards were not listening. Comparisons between what they had been promised about the war and what had actually happened. Discussions about the discrepancies between propaganda and reality. Some prisoners resisted these thoughts, clinging to their ideology, interpreting American kindness as a propaganda trick or a sign of weakness. But others, particularly the younger soldiers who had been drafted late in the war and who had less invested in the Nazi system, began to wonder. They noticed that the American guards never tried to convert them, never subjected them to political lectures or re-education programs. The Americans seemed genuinely uninterested in changing their minds. They just wanted to do their jobs, keep the prisoners secure, and go home when their shift ended. This lack of ideological fervor was itself puzzling to men who had been raised in a system where ideology permeated every aspect of life. How could a nation fight a total war without total commitment to an ideology? How could soldiers do their duty without the constant reinforcement of propaganda and political education? The answer, slowly dawning on some of the prisoners, was that America fought for different reasons. Reasons that didn't require constant ideological reinforcement because they were deeper and more personal. The camp routine reinforced these realizations. German POWs in American camps were put to work as international law permitted, but the work was not punitive. They were hired out to local farms, desperately short of labor because American men were overseas fighting. They picked crops, maintained equipment, did the routine tasks of agricultural life. And they were paid for their work, a small wage in camp scrip that could be used at the camp canteen. The farmers they worked for were, by and large, decent employers. They provided water breaks, adequate food, and reasonable working conditions. Some farmers, discovering that their POW workers spoke German, would speak to them in German themselves, asking about their families, sharing news from their own German relatives. The prisoners found themselves in surreal situations, enemy soldiers of the Reich, working peacefully on Kansas farms, speaking German with American farmers whose families had left Germany 2 generations earlier. Being treated with the same casual respect the farmers showed their hired hands. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "Today I helped Mr. Schmidt harvest wheat." His grandfather came from the same region as my father. We spoke about the old villages, the churches, the festivals. For 8 hours I forgot I was a prisoner. I forgot there was a war. It felt like I had traveled back in time to before all of this began. That sense of temporal displacement, of connecting to a world before the war, before the ideology, before the hatred, was profoundly disorienting and profoundly healing. Not all American camps were idyllic, and not all guards were kind. There were incidents of abuse, though they were relatively rare and, when discovered, usually resulted in disciplinary action. There were camps where conditions were harsher, where guards were indifferent or hostile. The American POW system, like any large system, had variations in quality and treatment. But the average experience, documented in thousands of letters and post-war testimonies, was remarkably positive, especially when compared to the conditions in POW camps elsewhere. German prisoners in Soviet hands faced death rates exceeding 50%. Those held by the Soviets could expect years of hard labor in conditions that barely sustained life. Even in British camps, where conditions were much better, resources were tight and food was rationed strictly. The American camps, by contrast, were almost embarrassingly comfortable. The prisoners ate better than civilians in Britain. They had recreation facilities, libraries, even sports equipment. Some camps organized theater productions, music performances, and educational classes. The goal was not to punish, but to contain, and the American philosophy was that well-treated prisoners were easier to manage and less likely to attempt escape or cause problems. It was pragmatic, not ideological, and it worked remarkably well. Escape attempts from American POW camps were rare, and when they occurred, they were usually half-hearted. Where would the prisoners escape to? The camps were in the middle of America, thousands of miles from any border, and increasingly many prisoners weren't sure they wanted to escape. They were safe, well-fed, and treated decently. The war was clearly being lost. Why risk their lives trying to return to a collapsing regime? The psychological impact of this treatment extended far beyond the war. When these German POWs were eventually repatriated, many of them returned to a Germany that was destroyed, occupied, and confronting the full horror of what the Nazi regime had done. The contrast between their experience as prisoners in America and the reality of what Germany had become was stark and unavoidable. And for many of them, their time in American camps had planted seeds of doubt that now blossomed into full rejection of the ideology they had once served. They had seen an alternative. They had experienced a society that was wealthy, powerful, and fundamentally decent. They had been treated as human beings by people who had every right to hate them. And that experience became a foundation for rebuilding their lives and their country. Post-war Germany's embrace of democracy, its rejection of militarism, its commitment to human rights, all of these were influenced by millions of individual experiences, including the experiences of hundreds of thousands of former POWs who had seen firsthand that there was another way to organize society, another set of values to live by. The American guards who shared cigarettes and stories in Kansas and Texas and 100 other camps had no idea they were participating in something larger than themselves. They were just doing their jobs, being themselves, treating other people the way they thought people should be treated. But in aggregate, their decency became a weapon more powerful than any bomb, a force for transformation that helped reshape a defeated enemy into an ally and friend. That is the deepest irony and the most profound lesson. That simple human kindness, extended even to enemies, can be more strategically effective than hatred. That treating prisoners well is not weakness, but strength. And that the values a nation embodies in its treatment of the powerless reveal more about its character than any number of battlefield victories. The German POWs, who were stunned by American decency, learned that lesson in ways that textbooks and lectures never could have taught them. And in learning it, they helped build a better world from the ruins of the one they had helped destroy.